really need to get together and let our voices be heard.
This is Buffalo What's Next. I'm Jay Moran.
I'm Bridget Jaipal Valenza.
I'm Dave Debo.
And I'm Thomas O'Neill White.
After May 14th, how can we afford not to talk about race?
About education, about segregation, about humanity.
Since the dawn of this nation, racial violence has existed.
The way we have designed our society has a big hand in what occurred in that Tops Market.
The suburban area, everywhere. We must work and teach our children.
We need to make sure that we put more funding in our programs that help prevent gun violence and more money into art.
If we're going to have some real healing, we've got to have space to tell some uncomfortable truths.
And good morning. Welcome to Buffalo What's Next. Today we're talking water in the city of Buffalo, and more specifically when it comes to water for residents in the city of Buffalo, water shutoffs. And you're going to be, I don't think, necessarily surprised if you've been hearing some of the issues raised during this program, that the highest proportion of those shutoffs happen in some of the poorest parts of the city of Buffalo. With us today from the Partnership for the Public Good, the research associate who put together a detailed report on this issue, Anna Blatto. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Most certainly pleased to have you with us. Let's just maybe structurally talk about how water works in the city of Buffalo before we kind of get into things. It might help educate us and enlighten this discussion just a little bit about what is obviously a very serious issue. People living without water next to a great lake here in the city of Buffalo. How is this structured? There's a private company that's involved in Buffalo Water. How does this work?
Yeah, so right now as it stands, the city of Buffalo still sees water as a public utility. So it's publicly owned. The system is publicly owned. But starting in 1997, the city started contracting private companies to manage billing and distribution, kind of the nitty-gritty aspects of the system. So we look at the way that Buffalo Water is operated as a public-private partnership where the city manages, or essentially manages, oversees what's going on with the water system, financial decisions, etc. But Veolia is a private company that does the management, that does the billing, that puts together proposals for infrastructure improvements and submits them to the water board that can approve or deny them. So in that sense, the city still retains ownership of the assets and has an entity that oversees the management, but Veolia is the private company that actually manages and bills for Buffalo Water.
A couple of questions about Veolia. First, why did the city need Veolia to be involved?
So originally, Veolia is I believe the third private company that has managed Buffalo Water. And originally they brought in a private company in 1997 after experiencing some financial hardships in the 80s and 90s. A lot of cities across the United States experienced financial difficulties during that time period. And the administration at the time, Maciel administration, along with the Common Council, were for several years brainstorming ways to improve the city's financial rating. And one of the ways that they looked into doing that was by selling the assets of the water system to a branch of the city government called the Buffalo Municipal Water Finance, or the Buffalo Municipal Water Finance Authority. And so they retained kind of ownership. So it was kind of, in that sense, separated from the city. And then through that, the Buffalo Water Board was kind of joined together to oversee everything. And as was common practice in the 90s for a lot of public utilities or other kind of previously publicly managed city or municipal elements,
right,
the city said, hey, we could probably save money by bringing in a private company, to manage the system. So some changes in tax code allowed for these contracts to be made with private companies without implicating the tax-free status of the public agencies. And in that regard, they decided to sign a contract with American Anglican at the time that was the first private company that managed Buffalo Water. And what was really interesting, there's actually a very deep public discourse around whether or not the city should engage a private company in this way.
I would think so, yeah.
Yeah, so there's a master's thesis, and that the majority of this the research on that time frame came from this master's thesis that was done, I believe, in 2010, and it looked at Buffalo News articles around this topic, and the city was arguing, we're in a bad financial situation, we're losing money by the management of this system that could be done much more efficiently and much more what they assume to be cost friendly by putting in this private company that has all this experience managing municipal water. And then there were union representatives on the other hand who opposed it because of the potential for job loss.
Okay.
And, if we bring in this private company, they're going to bring in private employees, and what happens to all the union
So that was
jobs?
one of the bigger criticisms or blocks was that part of it, union jobs, understandable that would be the case. Not so much citizens stepping up and saying, we don't want to turn over our asset to a private company. Right,
exactly. And I think that, in this sense, it was less about, because the city was still planning on retaining ownership, and that was part of the conversation as well. I'm sure it came up as to whether or not they were going to retain ownership or not, because there's different ways private companies can be involved in public utility function. And in this case, they decided on a management model where the city retains the assets and Veolia just manages, or whatever private company, the private company involved manages distribution, manages certain elements of the system. So at the time, there were little bits and pieces of public discourse around, do we want this? Do we not want this? But I think there was the most opposition coming from union leaders and representatives.
It's interesting. I guess then the idea is it's supposed to be more efficient. It's supposed to save money. Is it saving money? How can we tell?
Most research has suggested that that's not the case, and it might be partially practiced because it's thought to be easier to say, let's bring in this company that has worldwide experience doing this. But studies that have been conducted looking at water management across the country, there's one study in particular that looked at 500 water systems that were a mix between public and private management, saw that costs for consumers tended to be higher when water systems were privately managed. I think the average was $185 annually. That was the average higher cost if you're involved or paying for water through a privately managed system.
$185 more a year.
Yep, and that's what that study showed for the systems that they assessed.
Now, we're not talking about Buffalo there. We're talking about a group of cities that are studied. Just curious, what's the average water bill in the city of Buffalo?
Looking at Buffalo, let's say a household of 4, water, not sewer, probably about $700 a year.
So it's not out of the question that people are paying another $150 more for their water because, again, I'm drawing some conclusions here that probably can't be necessarily factually backed up, but there's the idea that $700 bill could be a little less, perhaps. It could be more efficiently handled.
If the case is, if the city falls into that trend of privately managed companies tend to charge more, then that conclusion could be drawn from that. Yeah.
Curious about the idea of finding out this information, because now you have a private company, you have a water board that oversees this. So these are kind of these quasi public-private entities. Getting this information that you've been able to come up with, how easy or difficult was it?
So data transparency in utilities is notoriously difficult, even though they are publicly owned utilities and there should be full data transparency, and in a sense there is. It's It's very challenging to get the data. There's no dashboard. You can't go online. There's no analytics site where you can see all these data points. The reality is that all of the data that we collected had to be obtained through FOIL requests. And FOIL is Freedom of Information Law. You have to submit these semi-technical requests to whatever agency.
Because they can be discarded for the smallest error or miscalculation.
Absolutely. And if it's too broad, they ask you to follow up. They are able to, they have to respond to your initial request within a certain amount of time, but there could be substantial delays with actually getting data from the agencies. And you can get quite a bit of data through the FOIL process, but it really takes a little bit of precision to learn the language or present the language to be able to get what you need, on a first try.
And how many, can you give me a ballpark? How many FOIL requests did you have to make?
Well, between me and the folks that I've worked directly with, probably a dozen.
Wow.
If not a little more than that.
And you don't necessarily want to mischaracterize people who are there to help or not help from these entities, but generally speaking, not easy.
It's not particularly easy, and I don't think it's necessarily the fault of the people who are fulfilling the requests. I just think a lot of the data is probably stored in such a way that makes it timely and difficult to give out. So, I mean, of course, they have to protect themselves as making sure that they're omitting maybe
privacy issues, things like that.
Exactly.
Okay.
So, the way that and in Buffalo Water, they may store their data in different ways, but the data that they were able to give us in a way that we were able to kind of dive into was through monthly reports that Veolia is required to submit to the Buffalo Water Board with various information about like servicing that they've done and the infrastructure that they're working on, and broad data about shutoffs and the variety of shutoffs that were performed for the type of shutoffs. But in order to dive really more deeply into understanding the scope of the shutoff issue, geographically where are shutoffs happening, what is the balance that folks are owing at the time, or owing to the water board at the time that their water was shut off, we had to request for worksheets turn off for non-payment worksheets. And what this turned into was thousands of pages of scanned PDFs. Wow. That have the address, the location of the shutoff, and then the person performing the shutoff, which is so Buffalo Water is still under the umbrella of the Department of Public Works. And so even though Veolia manages water, the Department of Public Works employees are still the ones who are going out and actually performing shutoffs or turn-ons or whatever is happening in terms of account operation in that regard. And they fill out these worksheets. So, of course, there's a lot of, how accurate is the data that is being filled out, but it's really the only data that's available. So, taking it at face value in that case. And what they would note is whether the property was occupied or vacant, and whether the shutoff was successful, whether the water was already found off when they went to attempt to turn it off, or whether they were not able to turn it off for another reason. For example, sometimes the curb stop, where the valve actually is blocked by a car, and it might be as simple as that.
Okay.
Your water can't be shut off because the car is on top of where the curb stop is.
We're talking with Anna Blatto from the Partnership for the Public Good. We're talking water in the city of Buffalo, and as you can already tell, Anna goes pretty deep with this particular topic for sure. Well, with this report that took about 2 years to come up with, we've talked about a very painstaking process of coming up with this information, which I always think is a fascinating part of this type of work, because I think that's something that always gets lost. Is just, you can see something in the newspaper or read something online, but the actual legwork that it takes to get these things done is very difficult and is also crucial to understanding what's really happening. Let's maybe just jump back to the lead a little bit. The findings, things that stood out from you as you started putting all this together. You go through all this process. What are you finding out about shutoffs in the city of Buffalo?
Sure. So when we dove more deeply into shutoffs, we focused on data from the full calendar year 2019, so January 2019 to December 2019.
Noteworthy, it's pre-pandemic. Okay.
Yes,
okay.
pre-pandemic, and also the last full calendar year during which shutoffs were allowed. And I mean that to say that in March 2020, as part of the state of emergency when COVID first began, for lack of a better word,
Sure.
the New York State issued a moratorium on utility shutoffs, and that prevented utility companies from shutting off essential utilities at any point in time for any reason, except for that maybe nobody was living in the property or by request, so they couldn't shut off for non-payment. And so then we saw this kind of pause on shutoffs of any kind, and that has implications of its own. So, but 2019 is substantial, is a good place to start, because it's where we may end up again if issues around this, the shutoff concern, affordability concerns, water debt concerns are not addressed. So that's the importance of 2019 in this report. And in 2019, we saw just under 8,500 attempted water shutoffs. And not all of those shutoffs were in occupied properties. Some of them were, in vacant properties, but 62% of them were in occupied properties. So over half of them were in occupied properties.
So over 4,000, almost 5,000 we're talking about here.
Absolutely. Okay. And just as a, reminder or just to emphasize, these are shutoffs exclusively for non-payment. They are not necessarily shutoffs for any other reason. They're not shutoffs by request. They're shutoffs, pretty exclusively for non-payment. And so when you look at the occupied properties, so these are attempted shutoffs, over 2,500 of those experienced a successful shutoff. So over 2,500 properties, occupied properties, actually had their water turned off. And that doesn't count the accounts or properties where the water was found off. So there's a lot of different elements that pull into it. And most alarmingly, I think, when we look at the raw numbers or the balances, looking at it from the top up, over 50% of those shutoffs were for balances of less than $1,000. So folks getting their water shut off less than $1,000, 11% of the overall number were for less than $500. So you're seeing this wide range of shutoffs for non-payment.
Let me just then dive into that just a little bit. So $1,000, we're saying that the average bill in a household in Buffalo is about $500-600, right? So maybe a couple of years behind, maybe less. What about that? I mean, how much grace period was given here? And to follow up on that, is it different for different people? Are we finding that as well?
Yes. That is kind of the biggest concern. And it's hard to go dive back or for kind of backtrack, I guess.
Sure.
To see how many notices were they given before their water was shut off.
We don't really have an idea of that.
Exactly. And the city of Buffalo is required, or the Buffalo Water is required to give notices of shut off so that folks can then address the shut off, can maybe go on payment plans, whatever the case is. But, if somebody owes, let's say somebody owes $2,500 and their water is shut off, we have really no good way of knowing how many times their water's been shut off in the past. We have no way of knowing what's been going on with their account. We have no way of knowing how many times they've received delinquency notice, whatever the case is. So then what we're left with is this incredibly large range of numbers. For residential shutoffs in 2019, the lowest number for an occupied shutoff, the lowest balance owed for non-payment, $185.
$185 and somebody had their water shut off.
In Buffalo at some point in 2019, yes.
How much money, I mean, this is out of the ballpark question here, but how much revenue or income is coming into this entity every year? Do we have any idea of that? I mean, we're saying it's less than $200. How big of a company are we kind of talking about here? A company might not be the right word.
Well, so I guess are we asking more about
just from the city of Buffalo?
No, just from the city of Buffalo. That value I have somewhere deep down in my numbers off the top of my head. I'm not sure, but there's.
But that would be a pittance.
That amount.
Revenues.
Oh, absolutely, and really the numbers that when I think about this issue, I think about a lot of different numbers. One number I think about in particular is the overall water debt that is owed by Buffalo Water customers, and that number is somewhere in the $12 to $14 million range.
Okay. And when we're talking about that, we're not talking necessarily active customers. That could be historical debt, correct?
Historical debt, or some of it might include commercial debt, and that's a whole other issue in and of itself.
Sure.
And for the purposes of the report, we focused heavily on residential properties to examine the impact on everyday people versus maybe a company that had gone bankrupt or bought a building and couldn't maintain it, something like that. So this small value, the pretty nominal $185 to see somebody's water shut off for that. There was on the opposite ends a property that had their water shut off, and the non-payment value was over $40,000. So it's this extreme range, and again, it's hard to backtrack, and of course the sizes of the buildings might be a little bit different, so you're looking at different scales. But
just curious, because I know as we were talking earlier that a lot of this is number digging and all that, but I know that you've taken it upon yourself also to kind of understand some of these stories that are going on here. You said one customer, $40,000, another one, $185. Do we know anything about some of these people who have had their water shut off, and maybe it wasn't done with the greatest of equity?
Yeah, we have some stories over the years, and mainly by virtue of the issue that originally kind of brought to our attention through the Western New York Law Center, which is a nonprofit located right here in Buffalo, of course, and Steve Halpern, who's a lawyer, who was a staff attorney at the law center at the time, was seeing a trend of customers coming to him and other attorneys at the law center saying, I'm in this water debt. I don't know what to do. I have this debt. I have my water shut off. What steps can I take? I feel X, Y, and Z isn't fair. I don't understand my bill, that sort of thing. And
generally, the Western Law Center is probably helping out lower income residents.
Their focus is on lower income folks. And because, and this is just kind of an aside here, but because a lot of folks generally folks see water shutoffs and water debt as a low income issue, as a poor people's issue. And the reality is it's very much in everyone's backyard, and it's not, it tends to concentrate itself among low income folks and low income households, but it's very much a widespread issue, and water unaffordability is really spiking. Water costs are up over 50% across the country.
So is water unaffordable?
Water can be unaffordable.
Okay.
Water affordability measurements are flawed in a lot of ways. They're measured as a percentage of medium household income right now, but the medium household income measurement that's used is for the municipality as a whole. It doesn't necessarily take into account that municipalities might have a range of people living in that.
Like this particular municipality, Buffalo, right?
Yep.
So, I mean, I'm going to put you on the spot here for the numbers, and you're carrying around a lot of numbers in your computer and also in your mind, and I appreciate you bearing with me here. But what about that? I mean, maybe the median income in the city of Buffalo, the median income in a select zip code on the east side.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually, this was a really big takeaway from trying to understand this issue locally. So in the city, median household income is about $37,000. And this, we looked at a lot of the data from 2019 to compare to the year that we did all of, or that the water shutoffs occurred.
Okay.
So we wanted to kind of make those similar comparisons, year by year. So it might be a little different now. but in 2019, about $37,000.
Okay.
In the zip code with the lowest rate of shutoffs for that year, which is 14222.
Lowest rate of shutoffs.
Lowest rate of shutoffs. Lowest, yeah. 14222, mostly Elmwood Village area. The medium household income was about $59,000.
Okay.
And water costs are the same across the city. Just to keep that in mind. In the zip code with the highest rate of shutoffs, it's 14208. The medium household income is $29,000. So you're seeing a $30,000 difference in median income, and yet the costs of these essential utilities that are made available to every single city resident are the same. So in 2019, when the city of Buffalo increased their rates for the first time in several years, they actually done a pretty decent job at trying not to increase the rates too much after having kind of a subsequent quick series of rate increases in the 2006 to 2010 timeframe.
Okay.
They added in a residential affordable water program where certain residents that meet income qualifications qualify for rebates on their water bills.
Rebates.
Yep. So
not a discount, a rebate.
Yep. So it lowered the water bill by a certain amount of money depending on the income. So they have, they have a qualifier for low income and for very low income. And for low income, it's about $15 every quarter. And for very low income, it's $22.50 every quarter. So it's pretty nominal, all things considered, but it was kind of a step. And essentially what the introduction of that program did was it buffered low-income residents from the increases that we saw in 2019. Those rebates essentially made it so that their water costs were the same, if not slightly lower, for very low-income folks than what they would have been prior to the the 2019 rate increase that we saw.
So not a heck of a lot of relief in that regard when it comes to it. What about when it comes to just the idea that the water is a resource? It belongs to the people. Do we see movements maybe elsewhere where that is moving up into the discussion that we can't have residents without water?
That there are advocates that have been advocating nationally for this for a while, and also statewide residents. There's a really great group of folks that work across New York State doing advocacy, working on statewide legislation in partnership with various municipalities around the state, looking to build a public discourse around utility, affordability, and the right to specific utilities, especially water, which is so essential. And there's a lot of concerns that have been addressed by those folks. In particular, the lack of federal involvement in this issue. So federally, there are certain programs that allow for low-income folks to receive some sort of financial assistance when it comes to heat, when it comes to like communications. Lifeline and HEAP are examples federally. There's no federal program that addresses water concerns. There's no federal oversight over water affordability. We're the only country considered to have an advanced economy in the world that doesn't have an agency of that nature that really oversees the ins and outs of water distribution, make sure it's equitable, or have the checks and balances at the federal level. So advocates really are looking at some very key things, looking at water debt and what that looks like and how it's increased, looking at ways to ease the burden of water costs for low-income households, and ultimately for ways to ensure long-term affordability through strategizing more cost-effective ways to charge folks for water. And in an ideal world, yes, it belongs to all of us. It should be free and accessible, but the reality is it's hard to offer a service like that with all the management involved
and infrastructure,
of course, for free. And so looking at more equitable rate structures really is a way forward to encouraging long-term affordability for especially for lower income residents.
We're going to take a little break here on Buffalo What's Next. Anna, catch your breath, have a little sip of your Publix coffee there, and we'll get back and talk some more. As you can tell, this is a deep issue, and it's worth noting for sure. Water shutoffs in the city of Buffalo disproportionately impacting low-income residents here in the city of Buffalo. Going to talk some more with Anna Blatto from the Partnership for the Public Good. You're listening to Buffalo What's Next on WBFO.
This is Buffalo What's Next, where we have conversations with the community about moving forward. To have your voice heard, press the Talk to Us button on the WBFO app, and we'll work to get your questions and comments on the air. Join us on Twitter at WBFO or email us at news@wbfo.org. Together, we'll have the conversations that are needed. This is WBFO, your NPR station.
And welcome back to Buffalo What's Next. We're talking about water shutoffs in the city of Buffalo. Anna Blatto from the Partnership for the Public Good going with us on this topic and taking us on a very fascinating ride into how this all works. And again, commending you on your efforts of digging up this information. It's yeoman's work for sure. When we went into break, we talked about maybe creating the idea of creating more equitable rate structures. Can you lay out what that might mean?
Sure. So the Environmental Protection Agency has definitions of what affordable means when it comes to water and wastewater services for residents. And right now, their measurement is 4.5% of median household income is what's considered to be affordable.
Okay.
And while that might be a sustainable value for folks who are making a little bit more money, it becomes a very large portion of income especially for lower income folks. And when water is also not tiered to match that, it's hard to say, okay, well, what 4.5% might be, for someone.
Back to our earlier discussion about not to necessarily pick on any particular issue, but we have one zip code in the city of Buffalo where the median income is almost $60,000, and then we have others where it's below $30,000. So obviously, it's going to be disproportionately affecting those households.
Exactly, and so the flaw in that measurement is that measurement really doesn't look. A median measurement doesn't focus enough on the lowest income folks that would benefit the most from some sort of threshold being in place that examines their incomes more closely. So some affordability experts have recommended looking at income quintiles, where income is broken up into 5 evenly distributed groups, with the median kind of falling right in the middle of like the third group. And then you look at the first quintiles being the lowest income, and then the fifth quintiles being the highest income, and then refocusing water costs on a certain percentage of incomes as they fall into those quintiles. So somebody who falls into quintile 1, for example, the lowest income group, they might not pay more than 1%, for example, on their water. So tiering water costs based on income. The reality of water affordability is that if water is unaffordable, you can have whatever water costs you want. You can raise the rate to be whatever you want. But if water is unaffordable, people won't be able to pay it. And it's going to be this constant game of, let me pay a little bit of money to get my water turned back on, but I'm still in water debt because I can't afford to pay it off. And what ends up happening a lot of times is that folks enter maybe repayment plans, which are pretty decent plans. There's usually 0% interest over a set period of time. Sometimes those plans, depending on how they're...
Are there late fees involved?
There can be, yes.
Okay.
And during COVID, there were a couple different programs that got put into place where folks signed up for plans under certain qualifiers. They could repay their water kind of at it at the principal, so they weren't paying any of the interest or the late fees. That would just be eliminated if they were able to pay back on the principal. But what becomes difficult is let's say that you've got, I don't know, $1,000 in water debt, and that's broken up into they've agreed on like a 12-month repayment plan. That's on top of your new water bills. So then you're doing this repayment. It's on top of your new water bills, and it might become very quick to say, okay, well, do I have to make a choice between electricity this month and heat this month? And that's actually, we bring up a conversation earlier about a story that we have. Please. Steve worked with a client named Mike, and Mike was very generous, agreeing to speak with us at the beginning of the pandemic when we were advocating for water reconnection for folks who may have had their water shut off, and that was kind of an urgent appeal in March 2020. But Mike was able to share his story, and his story kind of focused around his needs and making difficult choices when it came to cost and where he was going to put his limited income. So he was a veteran, Vietnam veteran, suffered from some health issues that caused him to not be able to work for a period of time, and he had to drive to the VA hospital for treatment. So the money that he did have, very limited income he had to prioritize his car insurance to be able to get to the hospital for treatment, and electricity, heat, and made a very difficult decision to say, I'm going to live my life in a different way and not have running water in my home. And he used rainwater to flush his toilet, and he bought bottled water, and it was ultimately just more cost effective for him. And we were able to Steve was able to work with Buffalo Water to kind of get his water turned back on, but the time he was living without water for almost 18 months. And that he might, be in this kind of anomaly. Most folks probably aren't living without water for that long of a period of time. But the difficult decisions that folks might have to make, where it's, we can manage without running water in the house. We need money for other things. Those are the decisions that folks are having to make.
And we need to also mention, though it doesn't happen a lot, there is the possibility of foreclosure if you do not pay your water bills. Yeah,
and water debt can be added to the lien on the property. Technically, the city is allowed to foreclose for just water debt, although a lot of times folks who are in water debt, low-income folks, might find themselves in other types of debt, tax debt, et cetera, that adds on top of that. There was a period of time, this is kind of an interesting aside, in I think it was like 2008 or 2009, where the city paused all any foreclosure that had water related to it, water debt related to it, because of billing inaccuracies. There was just a huge issue with billing inaccuracies. And
this is with a different private company?
It was with the private company prior to Veolia, and that's actually a major reason why the city switched, was because of dissatisfaction with the company that was managing it privately prior, some issues that, with them and the customer service they were providing. But one thing that we do find even today with the cost structure, with the the billing structure and the way that the bills are presented, is that the bills can be really challenging to interpret.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So the actual bill itself, the bills that you receive every month, those are pretty straightforward. They give you kind of a clear idea. This is how much water you used. This is your flat rate cost. This is your volume cost. Here's what you owe. Do you have any past due balances? But let's say that somebody's in substantial water debt. Maybe they owe, I define substantial as maybe over $1,000 or, somewhere around there.
Sure. A couple of years behind. And maybe you're looking at, okay, well, what are these costs? I'm ready to, see how I can get this paid off. What are these costs? And you're looking at these ledgers. And as part of this research, we actually brought one of the ledgers to an accountant, somebody with a PhD in economics at UB. It took a PhD to figure it out.
No, because they couldn't. So we have all these charges here, and it's like, the interest is charged at the same rate as unpaid city taxes. So you've got like a beginning interest that's like 4.5%, and then it drops down to 1.5%. And then you've got these fees that are all defined in the schedule of rates and fees that the Buffalo Water has available, but it's really challenging because a lot of times on these ledgers, what you'll see is like interest, and then it's this value, and it's fee, and then there's this value, and it's not defined where it came from or what it was for. And a lot of times, this has happened several times when, and I hear this from Steve when he was, kind of inquiring about different clients' bills. You go, what is this fee and what is it from? Like, it seems to match up with this, but we're not entirely sure. And well, again, anecdotally, we have folks, who are looking at it being like, yeah, I'm not entirely sure what it is. It might be this, it might be that. So that's a, kind of jumping a little bit, but
sure.
That's an advocacy point for us, is for more fair and equitable billing practices and billing structure, so that when you get a charge, you can see exactly where it's coming from. No questions, no debate. We want to know exactly how that was calculated and how that showed up on your ledger.
Any suspicion as to why that's the case? I mean, is it one of those things that sometimes companies are bureaucratic and can be inefficient and maybe don't do things clearly, it just kind of turns out that way? Or is there a suspicion that it's inscrutable for a purpose?
I don't want to necessarily say it's for a purpose. I mean, it probably doesn't hurt the company necessarily unless somebody really wants to dive deeply and say, oh, please, I need you to explain this to me. But I think what it turns into is whatever system is used to manage the costs and manage the ledgers, whatever documentation they're able to provide just isn't programmed to be particularly clear. So,
not customer friendly.
It's not customer friendly. That's really what it boils down to. And it's this back end system that really, maybe wasn't designed. It's maybe designed to be really helpful for monthly bills, where the monthly bills are pretty clear. But as soon as we start adding other fees and costs, it becomes very difficult to interpret.
It's interesting when you start talking about it in this realm, and I just use the term customer friendly. It almost seems when it comes to dealing with water, and maybe this is the way it is with other utilities, the residents aren't customers. They're, well, you fill in the blank of what they are. I mean, they have to do this. They have to follow a certain way, and yet the system isn't really set up for a customer's needs. I mean, I know you have some customer service background. You know what you have to do to please a customer. It doesn't sound like that's necessarily a priority here.
Yeah, and I think it's because it's monopolistic in its own sense. So I think, and this is just thinking out loud a little bit here, the reason a public utility is public is because it's essential. And it's essentially provided services like water, heat, electricity. And a lot of times, they might be privately managed, but the problem when it comes down to it is that then it becomes monopolistic. So I think right now about wireless internet, for example.
Sure.
In Buffalo,
you have to have it.
Yeah, you have to have it. It was never public. It's always been private, and now the public sector is kind of getting involved and saying we're gonna spend public money on investing in this type of infrastructure and subsidizing, et cetera, et cetera. But when you look at the companies that, let's say I want to sign up for internet in Buffalo, I have basically one option, and that isn't that in a structure of capitalism. That's not how it's supposed to work, right? It's supposed to be like I have all these options, and I'm able to negotiate and get a good deal. But in Buffalo, we only have one option, and that's kind of what these utility companies are turning into. They have a lot of leeway. Of course, they have to work within the structure of the law.
Right.
And that's the biggest difference, is that there's a lot of legal code and structure around how these companies are able to operate. But when they're the only company that is able to provide water to a large group of people, it's kind of like, if you want water, you just got to work with it.
You're going to play their game?
Yeah, a little bit. And it's, some of it might be, intentional. Some of it probably isn't. And it's just the way things are and the way things operate.
Yeah, Anna, we still have a few minutes to go here, and I want to continue our conversation. But I don't want to get lost when we run out of time. If somebody wanted to know a little bit more about this report, is it available? It
will be in the next couple of weeks. It's been a kind of a long time coming. It will be on PPG's website, ppgbuffalo.org, and it should be available in the next couple of weeks, I would say.
And I also want to bring attention. I thought we were going to fall back on this, but we had no trouble carrying this time talking about this water issue in the city of Buffalo. You previously did a report on the history of segregation.
Yes.
In the city of Buffalo. Is that report available as well?
Yes, absolutely. That report's available on PPG's website as well, ppgbuffalo.org. And that report gives a brief overview of the history of segregation and some of the modern implications. And it's a great starting point if you are looking to read and understand more about the root policy causes of segregation, because it didn't happen by accident. It was very much intentional. And the ways by which it persists even today are equally or similarly as intentional. So that is the baseline for a lot of the equity research that we do, is that it's within the context of a city that has experienced intense segregation and racial divides over the course of over a century.
I think it's a topic that has become of greater interest here in the last few months in the city of Buffalo. Again, that's ppg.org?
ppgbuffalo.org, yeah.
ppgbuffalo.org. Some invaluable information for you there. We've got about 3 minutes to go here, and we did not get to a lot of the topics that we wanted to get into, but I know there were some things that you definitely wanted to stress beforehand. I'm going to allow you this time to do that.
Absolutely. So there's two things that I just want to emphasize in the last time here. One is that the geography of water shutoffs and the Buffalo's presence of segregation and the way that the city is oriented are very much related. And when we mapped water shutoffs, we looked at residential occupied properties that experienced a water shutoff, and we found a high concentration of water shutoffs, of course, in low-income communities, which lines up low-income, difficulty affording bills, but also communities of color, and with a particular focus on communities with primarily Black residents. And what we found through our data, and this is like extremely alarming and draws even more importance to addressing this issue, emphasizing this issue, is that even when controlling for income, there's still a relationship between water shutoffs and communities of color. And so that's to say that if income levels, and by virtue of history and economic implications and racism and all these elements, segregation, it does tend that residents of color often have lower incomes as a conglomerate, right? But even when controlling for that, you see this volume of shutoffs happening in communities of color, which is just astounding and makes this issue even more worthwhile to address and present solutions for and discuss, have community discussions around solutions for. The other thing I do want to say too is that the city has taken some steps, and I do want to applaud the city of Buffalo because they are looking to use American Rescue Plan money to make some serious changes to the way that water is structured and to address affordability concerns. So, for example, they are planning to address, I believe it's $40 million in infrastructure improvements, which ultimately we hope will help keep costs lower for residents, because if the infrastructure improvement money is coming from this separate pool that was unexpected, then maybe it will lower costs on the in the long term, or can be used as a way to innovate on cost changes. The other thing, and this is the most substantial, is that the city is committed to $13 million for debt forgiveness for Buffalo Water customers. And there's been a little bit of information in the American Rescue Plan documents about how this will work, but there hasn't really been much discussion since maybe late 2021, a little bit here and there, in 2022 about how it's going to be structured, or maybe who's going to be involved in that program. But we are really excited to see that, and water debt forgiveness is the most difficult thing to get a municipality, I think, to commit to when it comes to long-term affordability, because it's a huge lump sum expense.
Right. And
a lot of cities don't see the value in spending money in that way. But really, the value is this. You're paying back yourself, and you're allowing people a fresh start. And I think that's going to be really exciting when more details about that are available.
Anna Blatto of the Partnership for the Public Good. First, thanks for your time, and thanks for doing this important research.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
This is Buffalo What's Next on WBFO.